this is the Scout bike that I've been working on, and I just want to point out a couple of things. Like when you're building miniatures, you often follow the instructions from start to finish. Sometimes that's a good idea and sometimes that isn't, because the instructions don't always take into consideration the painting phase. And with this Scout bike, the way it goes together is there's two halves, of which I green stuffed a little. I didn't mind the line fully. I didn't need to get rid of it if I didn't want to, because being padding, you could be stitching or whatever. Excuse me. So I didn't really try to get rid of all of it, although it might have, but that's okay. But the two halves came together, and these great big wheels are connected in between these two halves at the front and back. Now, I've only gave them a very basic paint job because I'm going to weather them and stuff like that. But if you went strictly by the instructions and you built the bike fully, painting these wheels, once they're assembled like this, can be a little bit trickier because you've got other stuff in the way that you may or may not want. Now, with the bikes, these are reasonably rudimentary, so it's not too bad to, if you get up under here and you put some stuff, paint you don't want on, like this area, on the mud guard, or down here on the back, you can always just cover it up with some dirt and stuff. But on other kits and figures, it might be a much bigger, sort of problem. So before assembly, always look at your miniature. Always look at the parts. Always look at how it's going to go together, because that's such an important phase, and you'll save yourself a lot of headaches, as you go on. This wasn't too bad a kit. Most GW stuff goes together reasonably easy. We had one mishap with the flag, so what I did was I made this like a radio antenna and put the flag on the other side just to be different. I used up most of the accessories that came with it, just stuck it on anywhere that they would fit. And what I'm going to show you is roughly how I do some of the basics. I don't think I'm going to do the whole bike, since I don't think everyone wants to sit here and watch me paint for 5 hours, but we'll cover a couple of the different things to get you started, and we'll see how we do from there. So one of your problems I think you're having is bleeding, which is when you're touching your miniature, instead of the paint just being where you're brushing, it's flooding out. That could be too much paint in your brush, and it can be too watery. Now, I thin my paints down generally a lot, but if you're going to do that, make sure there's not that much on your brush, because if there is, you'll go to just do one thing here and it'll just, capillary action, it will just run everywhere. So if you're going to thin it down, don't have much on your brush. If you leave it thicker, you get more control, but it will get more, it'll sort of glunk up and it'll look like paint. So you've got to find that nice medium. I don't actually have any GW paints handy, which is what you've been using, I think you said. So this is Vallejo Air. This is very pre-thinned already. Not as much for what I normally like, but for our intents and purposes, I don't need a lot. And as you can see, it's actually quite runny. Now, I normally use the Glaze Medium, and I like this stuff a lot. This is from Vallejo, and it helps it sort of, it thins it down, but not, it doesn't really lose its consistency, and it gets a nice translucency to it when you brush with it. So I like that stuff, but I'll use some of that later. But for now, okay, a couple of drops of water. I'd normally do twice as much, but as this stuff is already pretty thin, mix it up a little, rub off the excess. I sometimes do it on the back of my hand, which annoys the missus a lot. Now, I might not be as neat as I normally am because I have a great bloody big camera sitting in front of me. So this is pretty watery. Hopefully you can see it, but by being very gentle and not having much on my brush, I'm pretty much able to keep control of where I want it to go. Now, the less you thin down your paints, the more paint actually goes onto your Mini at any one time. Whereas if you thin it down, it doesn't. So you have to make a decision on how you want your miniature to look and how you want the miniature to go, because it's easier for a beginner to do more paint and less thinning. It's also, if you're an impatient painter, this style can be frustrating because you have to do multiple layers. Because I hope you can see, I have no idea to actually run this through, but with doing very thin coats, that's what's happening, right? When we thinned it down, you're not just making it more like watery for in the sense of it being pushed around, but we've also got less pigment going on. So we have to do several coats because it's just really thin. Now the benefit of doing really thin coats is it remains a level of translucency. So if you're doing different shades, then you can build them up. If you make a mistake and slip, you also don't have a great big glob of paint somewhere you don't. You can sometimes just wipe it off, if you're quick. And it also tends to give a nice natural sort of looking finish if you can get it right, because the water gives it a translucency that you don't get when you're just using a lot of the actual paint. Hopefully you can see the brown coming in, but yeah, we need to just keep working it up. Now I used the liquid green stuff in here that I wouldn't recommend on, I think it was the cave troll that you were working on, and it had the big gap around where the belly joined the body sort of thing. And that's because the liquid green stuff's really good, but it doesn't fill deep sort of crevices and that very well. And looking at that cave troll, that was a pretty big crevice, so you'd need like Tamiya putty or GW's green stuff, milliput. Any of that stuff works really good for filling those sort of gaps. Always fill your gaps before priming, which I didn't, because I was planning for the video and I wasn't thinking when I did it. You don't have to agonize over areas that are going to be covered either. I fully respect modelers that paint the entire interiors of tanks or aircraft and then seal them off and never be seen again, but I just don't have the time or inclination to do that. Or the paint, because it's using up resources when you do that. I mean, I get why they do it. They know it's there, they know they've done it, and that's cool, but I just can't be bothered. So with the seat, we're going to have a great big lumbering space marine who's going to be sitting in it, and he's going to cover up a fair amount of this. So normally I wouldn't paint it like layers and layers and layers. Anywhere that he's going to be sitting, anywhere that he's going to cover, I wouldn't normally worry about too much. I mean, you've got to put some paint down, you won't leave the base. But you could get away with not having to do as much. but we'll see how we go. I don't know. You guys will have to... Actually, I'll put this one up as is, and... I'll let you guys decide if you want to see all the parts of this puppy get done, or just the highlights. I was mainly doing this one so Louis could see how I mix the paint and how I apply my paint. But if you want to see more and not just the finished, then I can do that. Sorry for sounding slower than normal. This is actually taking more concentration than I originally expected. Now, right in here, there's a little join. I probably, if I was going for show quality, I'd probably have filled that in. It doesn't matter as much. I mean, these bikes, they might have been kind of modular in their design anyway. So, like some of these lines don't really detract. But it's something to watch for when you're doing your models. Anytime there's a line, like look at, if it's on something that's real, that's different. If it's not meant to be there, you want to try to get rid of it. But when it's on something like the science fiction bike, which reminds me a little bit of Judge Dredd's, but you can sort of get away a little bit more if you sort of look at it and go like, well, does it really get in the way, or does it look bad? Sometimes they look, these join lines, the mold lines, and that can actually be okay. I'm also a big one, I believe in artistic license. I believe that even when I do my World War II ones and that it's a... Yes, it is a representation of something that was real. But at the same time, it's also an art. So I think that when, you sort of mix the two, you have a certain leeway. Like I saw a wonderful diorama of a German anti-tank gun and crew, and it was in a building, in a blown-out building, and it was spectacular. But I'm pretty sure the way that building looked the first time that they fired that sucker, that whole building was going to come down on top of them. But what the hell? Because it did look pretty good. Now this Vallejo Air is actually designed for airbrush. That's why it's pre-thinned a lot. Out of focus, sorry. I like it for brush painting because I find it goes on really smooth. I've had modelers when they said, "What did you use?" and I say Vallejo Air, and they're like, "Don't you mean Vallejo?" "Nope, I mean Vallejo Air." "Well, why would you use Vallejo Air?" "It's used for airbrush. It's pre-thinned and it goes on smooth." "Why don't you just do it the normal way?" It's funny, I didn't know we were married. So it's getting there. That's the only thing, right? So if you don't love painting, and this is something with GW, like the military painters. Some of the military guys love to paint, absolutely love putting the miniatures together and everything. Others love the game, and the painting side and the construction side is just a pain in the ass and something they have to do to get to the game. So it really depends what you want to do too, right? You're not going to get best painted just slapping on paint, but if you don't care, right? Like, because the tournaments have best painted, but not everyone wants to go for that. So I mean, if you've got a big army to do too, doing it this way, it's just going to send you balmy. Because if you had a, I don't know, I saw some 800-point armies. Even, I mean, that's pretty big. So if you're gonna, you know, you're gonna paint them up one little bit at a time, layering all your orcs, you're just gonna go mental. Which is why the GW style tends to be subjective, like in the way it doesn't really blend highlight. It sort of just puts a different colour on, which looks alright from a few feet away, but not when you get close. But I mean, if you're doing an army and you've got like 50 models to paint, there's nothing really wrong with that. I'm also a firm believer, if you paid for the miniature, if it's your money, you do it how you like. If you want to paint this sucker pink, you do it. You know, you get a lot of complaints from people that you didn't do it right, or you didn't do it in the colours that they would have chosen, or whatever, but, you know, did they paint, you know, they didn't paint the mini, they didn't buy the mini. You know, if it's got on your shelf, you're the one that's got to be happy with it. Okay, so for my purposes on this, that's not too bad. As you can see, it's now reasonably solid. There's still a little bit shining through. I mean, I'd normally would do a couple more layers, but we're also going to do the middle. But I think, it's so hard to tell when I'm looking at the camera, but I think that it's showing that there's the different, by doing it in the different layers, even with the same colour, it's sort of thicker in some areas than others, and that gives it a little bit of a worn look. But I'm going to add another colour to it in the middle just to give it a bit of a extra look. So I'm going to just do that in just a sec. Okay, so I was toying with a couple of different colours, but I've decided I'm going to go with Brother Alex's choice, Dusky Skin. This was sort of, I don't know, you could use it for orcs, I guess. If you weren't going to go the traditional green, you could always go this sort of colour for orcs, but it's still in the brown range, so that works for me. Now, this is a Reaper colour, and I like Reaper a lot. They're sometimes a funny paint though. They're a little bit pre-thinned. This is their regular line, not their HD line. That's their HD. And these high density ones are more basing. These are a more basing colour. Although you can use them anyway, you know, it doesn't really matter, but there is more pigment in the basing ones. So these are still a little bit pre-thinned. Always be wary of letting brothers use your paint. Because it should come out in a couple of drops, but it's probably a little bit glunked up. The one thing about bottles you got to watch for is the paint can dry in this area, and you can have some terrible accidents if you're not careful. Do not be in or near anything expensive of your wives or girlfriends, because they will cause you physical bodily harm. And that's exactly what it was. So I just took a staple and I just poked down through the top of the hole, and it worked fine. A good practice is actually to get your paints every so often and give them all a shake, especially the ones you haven't used in a bit. So for this, I'm going to drop in about 4 drops, which is what I do with the water, same sort of amount. Give it a bit of a mix. And you can see the paint runs reasonably easily, and that's what you're looking for. If it's real, you don't want it like always like water, but you don't want it like paint either. This isn't too bad. I typically would go a little bit softer for what I'm doing, but what I decided to do was to sort of just maybe go around the edges a little. So what I'm trying to go for is he probably wears the middle more because that's where his back is than the edges. So the edges might be darker. But what you can do, which is what I like doing, is coming back with my original colours, especially when they're still wet. Just one thing I noticed about the Reapers too, which is funny, they're a funny paint in that I've often done them when I've painted and I've thought, oh, these look terrible, like this is not going to work at all. And I've gone away in disgust, come back in the morning, and they look fine. It seems to be how they dry. Okay, it's better. Because this is like leather or hide, so having them sort of mixed together, which is wet blending. Although when I don't do wet blending brilliantly, I freely admit. I've seen some amazing blenders. And they just seem to have that magic touch. But for what we're trying, and on this sort of model, I think we'll be okay. Good. I like dusty skin a lot, so I might just, since I used it, might put some on the handlebars and the grips. They're probably metal, but on my old motorcycles they're actually foam, some of them. The VFR 750 was a foam accelerator. So we can have a leather. Or hide. Always fun trying to find somewhere to hold your mini where you haven't painted. Too much. If you can see a droplet on the end of your brush, you have too much paint. And actually I might do the saddlebags as a base colour, and then we'll highlight and shadow in different colours, so that'll make it not look the same colour as the seat. I mean, paints aren't massively expensive, but they're not massively cheap either, so any time you can use a colour that you've actually got on your table, I think that's good, save you money. Okay, I don't know if you can see the drop? Too much. So I usually use my hand. I just touch it there, let it bleed off a little. Quite like these saddlebags actually. Well, saddlebags, blankets, whatever the hell they are, wrapped up. Fair amount of detail actually for GW. A lot of their stuff is a bit blocky. And this is the stuff too that I like to put on the things. I mean, this is what makes it more interesting and brings it more to life, is having these sort of things like the bags and the kit and the extra gear, than rather than just a straight out bike or straight out like vehicle. You get to do stuff. And at this stage you don't have to be too neat. If you spill some here or there, that's okay, because we haven't done the other areas yet. You haven't spent ages highlighting and doing all this amazing stuff, and then you turn around and suddenly put something where you don't want. Like there, I put a little bit on the strap. It doesn't matter at the moment because we're going to paint the straps later. These bikes are reasonably solid. You can grab them in most areas and not break stuff, which is good. Some of the other stuff's really flimsy. Oops, I'm off the table again. Sorry when that happens. Trying to watch both the camera and the mini. Hoping this isn't too out of focus. It's hard to tell. If it's rubbish, sorry guys. And I try to move around where somewhere's dry or nearly dry. That's when I'll put the next bit in. I try to avoid areas that are still really wet. You can tend to push paint around. Sometimes I want to if I see there's a gap and I can sort of get in there. Always look underneath. It's easy to forget to do under the saddlebags. So there we are. I'll stop for now. You guys can let me know if this is worthwhile and if you want to see more like this. It was mainly for Louis, but you know, if there's some benefit in it, I don't mind doing them. So just let me know in the comments, and happy modelling, guys.